Welcome to Friday of GDC. And for some of you, welcome to GDC. You get to start with me, and I'm going to talk to you about management. My name is Jenny. I'm an engineering manager at DeepMind, and I've also worked at Riot Games, Zynga, and a bunch of other places. And this is a talk about being managed, or having a manager, not being a manager. I basically wanted to collect some of the things I've learned after being on my side of the table that I really wish I'd learned sooner. I've worked at some pretty big companies, so some of these things will be pretty tactical to that situation, but I do hope that even if you're in a smaller studio, there's something in this talk for you when you're working with someone who's got a little bit more power than you do. I hope there's one takeaway from this talk that every single one of you will be able to put into practice, and if you know everything, great, go teach it to someone else, please. I will caveat that, there's going to be a few generalizations. I'm talking about the average case, and obviously, sometimes that manager relationship can go bad. That's a different talk. It's not really for this stage. But I am going to be outside in the wrap-up area right after this talk. I don't have time for questions. I'm just going to go straight there afterwards. Please come talk to me. Happy to talk about this subject all day long. Finally, I have put together an online resource handout with a lot of the stuff I talk about, so don't feel you need to take notes. There will be a link at the end of the talk. Rather than make this a talk of Jenny thinks stuff, I also talked to a whole bunch of people who are also managers or have had managers, and I want to thank all of them for their input. So let's get going. It's day one at your new company. You get shown your desk, and hey, here's Jeff. He's your manager. I will be using Jeff as a fictional coworker throughout this talk. I picked the name somewhat at random. It's not a real Jeff. So you generally don't get told what that means. Just, hey, he's your manager, cool. So let me tell you what I mean by manager. Well, management means a lots of different things to lots of different people. So when I talk about it, I really just mean the person that you report to in an organizational chart. They may have hired you, they may have some kind of power to promote you, but they're like the person above you in some kind of weird hierarchy thing. Cool, that's who they are. What do they do? Well, I asked every single person from that previous slide that question, like, what do you do, or what does your manager do? And no two people said the same thing. So that's a good start. Maybe think, okay, maybe I'm onto something doing a talk about this. Words came through like empower, advise, coach, listen. Okay, there's a pattern there. It's about the art and craft of building humans, not games, not software, but humans. To build games, you need humans, so that's kind of cool. Management is needed. But, right, okay, I'm a manager. My job is to do that, to build humans. So why should you folks care? I just should be doing my job, right? Fundamentally, it's your career. Even the best manager in the world won't care about it as much as you do. So if there's any way you can take even an iota of control over that and put yourself in the driving seat, why not? And that's really what this talk is going to be about. Because another real truth that came through, especially as I talked to a whole bunch of folks, management isn't often its own job. I'm actually fairly privileged that I get to spend a lot of my time on this craft. But most managers, especially in game dev, are doing other jobs, like they're the art lead or QA lead or a lead programmer, and they've just been asked to manage people, usually because somebody else quit. Half the time, they don't get any training at all. So they might have no training. They might not have even been told what the job is. They might have just been told, hey, Jeff's left, you're now the manager, good luck. And some of you might realize like you don't even necessarily want to be. You've just had to step in. So this talk might give you more insight into management than some of your managers have ever had. And that's scary. And that kind of brings me to the biggest point I want to make in this whole talk, and also the most obvious one, I'm afraid. We are humans. And okay, I work at DeepMind, so I had to add this. I'm not trying to excuse mediocrity, but I'm kind of trying to explain it. We make mistakes as managers. We are learning this craft in production. And even an experienced manager, humans are so varied and delightful that the problem you bring your manager might be the first time they've had to deal with it. I learn new stuff every week, every month. All right, I still haven't told you what the job is, so let's talk a bit more about that and what you and your manager, what that contract should look like. Inside every manager, there are two wolves. These are my dogs. Bear with me. This is Sammy. He is a golden retriever, and he loves people. Loves people. Can't take him anywhere. He is incredibly human-oriented, so that's half one of a manager. My other dog, Sister's a 10-year-old rescue, and she is results, business. When is my next food? When is my next meal? And that's it. And so, as with my dogs, managers have to balance the needs of the people and the needs of the business. That's easier than it sounds, and your contract with your manager should look a bit like this. They help you do the thing you are paid to do. Fundamentals. Sometimes it stops there, but ultimately, you're being given money in exchange for your time, and your manager is there to make sure that that makes sense to everybody involved. The best part, my favorite part, is they then elevate that. They level you up, and they find ways to grow you, ideally in ways that you want to be grown, and find ways to just make you more than you were. And the third part, which is often downplayed, but still a big part of it, is making sure that all of that is in line with where the game wants to go. If I told my manager I wanted to take a class in origami folding, cool, not so relevant for my job, so maybe not on company time. I don't know, I haven't asked him. How do managers do this stuff? On the left, people-y stuff. On the right, worky stuff. So using formal processes and where you might spend most of your time with your manager, one-on-ones and direct support, coaching, help. On the other side, your manager has a whole bunch of context on the world around, and it's part of their job to share that with you and help you make the most of that. And I'll get later in the talk into how you can kind of get some of that from them. And the fourth part, I wanted to call this out because as a manager, a lot of my reward loops are really long. I run into people at GDC who say, hey, this thing you told me like 5 years ago was really helpful. Like, if I was a player in a game and it took 5 years to get the reward, I don't think I'd play that game. So getting very hands-on and trying to just feel like I'm useful is a big part of the job too, but it can become interfering. So we'll get to that as well. Let's jump in with the actual concrete stuff. So the second half of this talk is really giving you a bunch of things that you can do in these areas. Now, I don't do all these things every day. I gave this talk at work last week. My manager was in the audience, and he's just looking at me going, you don't do all these things. I don't. It's situational. I have done each and every one of them. The people I talk to sort of sanity check my thoughts also have done a lot of them. So they are really useful tactics. And especially now we're in a hybrid world, and your manager might not have as much visibility into what you're doing. It's good to have some concrete things. I will give you a warning, though, that the more you nerd out about this stuff, the more likely it is you're going to become a manager. So I like it. But all right, let's jump in. Feedback, cool. So asking for feedback. Actually, there's a second part to this. Getting it. Now, when I say feedback, I don't know how many of you had that visceral reaction, feedback. We often use the word feedback and we mean critical feedback. I actually like to broaden that to any kind of feedback. And it can be harder to get the positive stuff, but it's really important. I was told once that you want to have at least 5 pieces of positive feedback for every piece of growth feedback. And usually we really don't. So think about that. When we do get brave enough to ask for feedback, it can look like this. And don't get me wrong, this is better than not asking, for sure. But if you ask me this question in a meeting, you put me on the spot. I am a human being, as I pointed out. I really promise I am a human. And saying Okay, feedback. Okay, what am I thinking? I'm trying to be kind of nice because you're sitting right there. I'm super recency biased because I haven't had any time to think. And I'm also probably going to shy away from the difficult topics because I need to word those very carefully to make sure my message is on point. So I might say, oh, you did a great job with that talk last week, instead of really thinking about your goals and where you're going and what might be the most useful thing to say to you. And I don't know about you, especially the minorities in this audience, but when we ask this question, we often get just like, no, you're doing great. It's cool. That's completely useless. I mean, it makes you feel good for 5 seconds, but it's not much use for growth. So what do? Well, ask specific questions. It's important to be curious and mean it. And that's something I've had to work on. Because I don't want to get told that I suck. Nobody wants to get told that. But if I try and frame it in my own head as I genuinely want to be better, I really want to know how I can achieve my job outcome in a more exciting and better way. And it's okay to ask for a positive feedback here. It's like, hey, I thought that went really well. Do you agree? I think it can be difficult because you're sort of shaping the narrative a bit when you craft this question, and making sure that your growth goals and the question are kind of in the same place is useful. For me, if someone asks me this question, I might want to know, well, why are you improving your technical writing skills in the first place? I can give you some very specific feedback on your document, but maybe that's not the conversation we should be having. So think about framing it to get what you want out of that question. Something it's taken me a really long time to understand is this kind of, I guess, semi-cliche. Feedback is a gift. That means a couple things to me. It means I'm genuinely thankful for someone showing me what's inside their head. Because if they are giving me that feedback, then they're thinking that thing. And they have chosen to tell me that so that I can choose whether or not I do something about it. That is a gift. Even if it hurts, even if it cuts you to your soul, it's still a gift because they were thinking it anyway. The other part of a gift is you can choose what to do with it. I don't always use all the Christmas presents I get, like I get that many, but yeah, there is a point where you're like, no, okay, thank you. I appreciate your point of view. I acknowledge that that is how you feel and think. I'm not going to change. Now, it is useful to close that loop sometimes. Some people's feedback can be worded in ways that is open-ended. Maybe you should check out that course on C++ on that website. No, I'm not gonna. Thank you for the gift. Why didn't you check out that course? Okay, let's close the loop and be like, you know what? I'm not going to do that because I've got these other priorities. But it's also like, it's your choice what you do with the feedback. It's hard because my favorite slide. Vulnerability, making yourself open to growth is hard. It's hard to admit that I'm not perfect. It's really hard to ask for help. And this all ties up into imposter syndrome, which is like the next talk in this room, so I'm not going to derail myself. But like, it's very hard to get vulnerable, especially as somebody who has some kind of power. Feedback can confirm the stories we tell ourselves in the dead of night. But I wanted to add my perspective as a manager onto this. Like, one of my jobs, as I pointed out earlier, the middle one, is to help you grow. If I'm giving you some feedback, it's because I deeply care about you and I think that you can make that growth. Because if I don't care, I'm not going to give you the feedback. So I believe in you. My feedback is a gift for that reason. Doesn't make it easy. It's still really, really hard. But it makes it a little more bearable, I suppose. So let's talk about the ultimate feedback process. Yeah. So it's March. Those of you in larger companies might have just had one of these. Congrats, you made it through. I didn't know much about these for a long time, actually, even though I had these yearly meetings. So I wanted to demystify a tiny bit. This is a real company's performance cycle, anonymized. Yours probably looks a bit like this if you have one. Please go find that out. It is information you are entitled to have. It's not secret. A couple of takeaways from this. You have to write some kind of self-review in December. Cool. I don't remember what I did last week and it's March. So by the time you get to December, a lot of people just write really high level stuff, or they write very recent stuff, or both. And I want to tell you how to kind of help yourself and write the best performance review that I've ever seen. The other thing around this timeline is by the time it gets to March and you have that conversation, hey, you had a good year, you had an okay year, whatever, that's not the time to say, okay, but I want a promotion, where is it? That conversation happened months ago. The budget was set. Like, you have to start the conversation for the next year's cycle and understand at your company whether promotions are something that have to happen at specific times or can happen at any time, because that can be very different across companies. In terms of having the best possible performance review ever, especially early in my career, I kind of, again, obvious facts, right? But I didn't realize this. I sort of thought my manager knew everything and that their job was to pull it all together and write this thing. We are not. We are only human. We can't be in every place at once. You have a better idea of what you've done and achieved than we do. So the more that you can equip us to have a good set of information at the end of the year, the better we can make your review. That doesn't mean that we're just going to copy paste what you write. There is kind of a craft on top of that, but you can have a lot more influence over your review than you might realize. Here are my 2 concrete tactics to make that awesome. Create 2 docs and write stuff down. There's going to be a bit of a theme of writing stuff down. I apologize. So creating a running log of the stuff you do. I like to do this weekly. I set a calendar reminder on Fridays. If you have an end of week ritual, tack it onto that, because it's easy to forget and fall behind on this. But it's really important to do it, especially if you can capture the impact your work had while you remember it. Cool, I did that bug, it made a performance improvement. Great, awesome. That actually saved the company money. Maybe it impacted retention numbers. Maybe it has some awesome reviews on the internet. Like, collate that when it happens, because at the end of the year, you can look back on that and be like, wow. Like, anybody at the end of the year can go back and look at CLs or commits or whatever, but looking at the impact and the why is a lot harder. I also like to create a wins folder, and a lot of people I spoke to do this as well. This is more for your own use. So the done thing, you can share with your manager if you want, or you can keep it to write your performance review. Either is an option. The wins folder is more private. It's your own kind of list of brags of cool stuff that people have said about your work. You can pull this through into the I did stuff side quite easily, but it's also really nice as a pick-me-up in a hard week to help you when you're interviewing, or just to remind you why you do your job when it's, when you're in the trenches and everything's broken and you're just trying to get through the week. These look a bit like this. Capture as much as you can. Don't make it an essay. Don't make it a chore or you'll stop doing it, but please start doing it. If you have the best performance review in the world, you might be lucky enough to be thinking about promotion. Now, I will say promotion's not the only goal in life. A lot of people like having more money, so I like to talk about promotion. But if you're not interested in it, that's cool. But for those of you that are, your company probably has some kind of job ladder. I'll get to what happens if it doesn't in a second. This is an example of a thing that Riot published a few years ago. It's not active, but it's kind of an example of, hey, at this level, you need to do this kind of stuff. At the next level, you need to do this kind of stuff. And at your company, especially if it's a larger company, this will be somewhere, and you are entitled to this information. You can look through this, get an idea of how you're tracking against your current job and how you're tracking against the next one. And then, sounds simple, right? Talk to your manager about it. Make it a collaborative question. Why haven't I been promoted? Jeff got promoted. You may be feeling that way, I understand, but it's easier to have this conversation if you approach it with collaborative mindset. What would it take? How do we get there together? You start to plant the seed in your manager's head that maybe you could be promoted. And if you're not having this conversation, I guarantee you somebody who doesn't look like you probably is, for the minorities in the room. Then you take that information, you write it down. You don't have to do this. There we go. This is a little overkill for some folks, but it has been needed at times, where you're basically writing down what's called a gap analysis between your current level and the next level, and capturing what you've done that shows you're at that level and what you're working on to get to that level. Now, there are some extreme cases where you maybe are already at the next level and you're really feeling that hasn't been acknowledged. In that case, I recommend not starting with that previous question, because if somebody asks me, oh, I'm not at senior yet, what do I have to do? I'm sure I'll find something. Whereas if they say, I think I'm at senior, here's why. It's framing the conversation a little differently. But hopefully you won't need that. Now, what happens if you don't have one of those wonderful career ladders? Well, there are some public ones you can start to look at. You can reverse engineer job descriptions. You can do my favorite thing in the world, which is talk to people with the job you want and ask them what it takes to be a good senior engineer, lead artist, whatever. And then take that distilled knowledge back to your manager and say, hey, I figured out that senior engineers lead projects. I'd like to lead a project. That is, I guess your manager's going to say, oh, it's very proactive of you. It's really you're doing their job for them. But if they're not doing it, who cares about your career most? You. Something else to know about promotions that I, again, thought my manager was kind of this celestial being for a really long time. Managers are not fairy godmothers. I can't just wave the promotion stick and get you all promotions. I wish I could. I really wish I could. There's normally some kind of grand council of wizards that meets and decides that so-and-so gets promoted, so-and-so doesn't. Here's how many slots we have. Here's what the budget is. Your manager is in that room talking about you. The more you can equip them with information, with justifications, and with rock-solid arguments, the better. And that's kind of why I like having the wins folder, because it gives me a sense of how people on the team think about me and see me. It's very rare that we get out of our heads and remember that everything we see about our work is not what anyone else sees. And so when you're in that room being talked about, somebody's going to remember that one thing that you said on Slack that was a little bit offensive. And the more you can do to shape that narrative, the better. So cool, I want to be senior, I want to lead a project. Let's talk about how to have that kind of conversation with your manager. Setting expectations. I have personally been in the situation where what I thought my job was and what my manager thought my job was were different things. And we did not talk about it until the performance review. I am no longer at that company. It did not go well for either of us. Having a conversation that's just as simple as, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm spending my time on, is really valuable. If you've just started a job and you're like entry level, maybe slightly less needed, but still a good habit to get into. Writing stuff out, if you're split across different initiatives, if you've got involvement in a diversity group or some other side projects, make sure your manager knows about that. And I recommend try not to ask, what do I do? Try to say, this is what I'm doing. Can I sense check it? Can I get your thoughts? And give them a chance to collaborate with you, but make it yours, not theirs. The more senior you are, the more specific you might want to be here. I like the OKR format. It's linked in my doc at the end. If you want to be like really clear on your responsibilities as a more senior person. But as a more junior person, you don't need to overthink it. But I do recommend you communicate. A good time to do this is right after your performance review, if you have one. Another good time to do any of the things in this talk is to say next week, I just saw this talk at GDC. Let me jump off of that conversation starter into a suggestion of how we work together better. Once you've set some kind of expectations of what you're doing, it's also important that you don't just fire and forget. Managers can't be everywhere at once. So how do you manage that from your seat? Think about your manager's job for a minute. Which teams are they on? Which meetings are they in? What do they see? How much of your work is invisible to them? I once had a performance review, different job, where my manager had no idea of the diversity work I was involved in, and it was quite a big part of my work. I had not learned from that previous situation. I hadn't set my expectations properly, but I just hadn't also thought that he doesn't see that. So, depending on where your manager is on the micromanagement to no management at all spectrum, you can either ask them directly, how do you want to keep updated? Or you can figure out, okay, they're too busy, but they're in these meetings. I can be in those meetings too. And trust me, I've worked in infrastructure. You can put infrastructure in the team show and tell next to the new characters, next to the audio updates. Infrastructure belongs in those show and tells too. And I won't take no for an answer on that one. Your manager's not the only person in your life. You work with people every day. You have people in your discipline that are a bit further away, but know the company. You've got people that maybe look more like you than your manager. I've had 15 managers and only one of them was a woman. And I'm still kind of impressed that one of them was a woman in engineering. I'm trying to change that, but there we go. You can also get external cheer squad support from people outside your company because sometimes your company's really messed up and somebody outside needs to tell you that. Your manager will talk to these people for your review. So have these kinds of conversations with them and make sure your manager knows who they are so you can get that big picture. And again, set yourself up for the best review ever. 6 of 6, one-on-ones. Now, you've probably got some kind of regular meeting with your manager. They are your time. What that means is your manager can talk, but that you should get what you want out of them. Now, one-on-ones often look a bit like this, especially after a long time with the same manager. I see, yeah, for me too. So that's great if that's what you want out of the time. But really what this is an unqualified therapist giving you advice and stuff that, sure, you can talk about it, but there's other ways to give your manager that information. Per my earlier slide, there's a lot of other things you could be using this time for. And your manager literally owes you these things. It's their job. They're there to help you, connect you, and grow you. So as with any meeting that's gone off the rails a bit, you can set an agenda. I have a template for this, but honestly, it's kind of self-explanatory. Put a collaborative doc, both add to it, and make sure that you use the time for that. And if your manager is always running out of time to discuss that one thing that you really want to talk about, schedule a one-off 30-minute meeting entitled Career Development Conversation. They can't escape if you do that. You may have heard this piece of advice as well, bring solutions, not problems. Now, spiritually, I do like this. But I think it's a little overused. So I want to rephrase it a bit. What that phrase means is, rather than saying, hey, I feel like you're undermining me a little bit, you're not really giving me space to grow into my seniority, it means saying, could you please just stop coming to those meetings? I would really appreciate it. And as a manager, if you tell me what to do and tell me this will help me, it's way more likely I'm going to do the thing that will help you than if you just say, I'm feeling kind of undermined by you. I will probably try and think what that means and do the wrong thing. But sometimes what you need from your manager is a conversation. It's advice. It's not a solution. So really, I'm just telling you how to communicate with somebody else. And in terms of the manager relationship, you are entitled to ask your manager for what you need. They want to help. They may derail into giving you unnecessary advice or even mansplaining at you if you just give open-ended comments. So the more you can shape that dialogue to what you actually need, the better. And I know it can be hard and sometimes scary to ask for this stuff. But as I think I've said like 1,000 times, your manager's there to help and support you, and it is their job. Fundamentally, we're humans, we take shortcuts, and we will try and go through the shortest path of least resistance. So the more that you can show us what that path looks like, the better we can help and serve you. Because fundamentally, we're all just humans. We're all trying to do our best. And I happen to be above you in the org chart, but I'm still just somebody who's going to make mistakes. Almost at the end, I've got a couple takeaways, and then we will head straight out to the wrap-up room to continue the conversation. Hopefully you found your one thing from this talk that you're going to go do. Here's some ideas if you didn't. Ask your manager their priorities. It's a great way to start getting all that wonderful context out of their head. Start tracking your work. If you're not writing your work down, please just do. Just do it, trust me. And start thinking about that cheer squad and who is not in it that maybe should be. Maybe somebody in this room. I asked all those wonderful people I mentioned for some final words of advice for this talk, and this is what they said. They actually said too much for me to fit in one slide, so I distilled it. Fundamentally, the overriding theme of them is like, it will be all right. I've given you a lot of information. Some of it's a little bit overwhelming, scary, maybe a bit awkward. It will be all right. And most of all, find someone who you can trust at work, even if that's not your manager, especially if that's not your manager. Final slide, QR code, resources. There is a link on that page to submit new resources or feedback if you have any. Otherwise, thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful GDC, and I will see you outside.